Part 56. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 551. The lamp in the inn-room is as bright as a bean, and you can hear the drop of a needle. Ning Qingyi sat on the bedside stool and followed Su Buling's instructions, staring at Zhongli Jiju seriously. Su Buling chased him out for a while. The dizziness caused by Zhongli Jiju's extreme embarrassment gradually subsided. Reason returned to his mind, and his eyes changed from fear to shame. Secretly taking a glance at Ning Qingyi, who was sitting in front of her, Zhongli Jiju quickly lowered her eyes when she saw him staring intently, her face turning red and white. The truth has been revealed, and there is no point in blaming yourself or feeling regretful. What you should be thinking about now is how to deal with the current situation. Chu Chu is very simple-minded and lonely, and never trusts others easily, but once she believes it, she has no reservations. Now that someone like her, who is her master, does such a thing, she must be completely disappointed. Zhongli Jiju felt that she should go out and apologize to Chu Chu, whether she beat her or scold her. As long as Chu Chu's grievance and anger were vented, the anger would naturally dissipate, and then she could slowly explain the matter to Chu Chu. But Zhongli Jiju is now huddled in the corner of the bed, unable to get out at all. Just now, Su Buling and Su Buling were making love in the room, but for some reason they were encouraged by Su Buling, and they obeyed and rode on Su Buling. As a woman, she was so dizzy at that time that she had no time to pay attention to what was going on outside. Both of them were at a critical moment. When Su Buletinling realized something was wrong and slapped her awake like an octopus, Chu Chu was almost at the door. Zhongli Jiju was completely confused at that time. She was afraid of being discovered by Chu Chu, so she held her skirt and tried to escape from the window without even thinking. She never thought of opening the window and bumped into Ning Qingyi. She didn't even put on her clothes. Even though she was from her daughter's house, even if she was thick-skinned, she would feel embarrassed if she was bumped into by someone while doing that kind of thing. What's more, she was quite thin-skinned. Ning Qingyi again, it was Su Buling, the woman who preceded her and was technically her sister. She was a coquettish woman who seduced other men. Now Ning Qingyi was sitting in front of her, staring at her very intently. Zhongli Jiju felt as if her face was on fire. She wanted to put on her dress, but was too embarrassed to lift the quilt, so she could only hold on like this. Ning Qingyi, who was sitting on the stool, had a meticulous expression and glanced at Zhongli Jiju with her cold eyes, looking like she was doing her duty conscientiously, as if she was doing a very ordinary thing. But the cold expression was just to cover up the shame and embarrassment in his heart. Ning Qingyi has been staying in Changqing Temple since she was a child. The Quanzhen religion forbids sexual intercourse with women. Let alone seeing it, she has never heard of such a thing several times. The last time she was allowed to kiss her, she was stunned for months, and even more needless to say, we now see each other face to face. Fortunately, she was not the protagonist this time. Although Ning Qingyi felt strange, she was not too embarrassed. People are always curious, especially about things they have never seen before. Ning Qingyi was less than 20 and was in her youth. Although her rationality made her deliberately not touch those unclean things, she would inevitably pay more attention when she encountered them. So big, it would be a pity not to breastfeed the baby. Su Buletinling seems to have pinched me, it's a little red, I really don't know how to feel pity, I've been pinched, I also pinched me last time. Why is there still water on the bedding, could it be that he is sweating? Ning Qingyi was thinking wildly, but her face was naturally cold, and her eyes were always a bit sharp, as if she was examining Zhongli Jiju. Zhongli Jiju was stared at by Ning Qingyi so much that she didn't even dare to express her anger. After holding onto the quilt tightly for a moment, she couldn't hold it any longer and said sarcastically, "Qingyi, why don't you go out and see Chu Chu?" Ning Qingyi came back to her senses, sat upright, and her eyes became more serious. No, you can't bear it and commit suicide. How can I explain to Su Buling? Although I don't like his pervert, but one code is the same, and I won't do this. I don't care if I show my temper at any time. If you keep staring, I really want to commit suicide. Zhongli Jiju was in trouble, and if Yan Ningqingyi didn't leave, she would have to remain in the situation of being caught and raped in bed. Which woman can bear this feeling? It's a pity that Ningqingyi's character is like this, upright and serious but not very worldly. It's like finding out that shopkeeper's son has lost money and making up for it himself. He does the right thing but forgets to consider the other person's inner feelings. Ningqingyi must not be able to understand how much Zhongli Jiju is suffering at this moment. The two of them stared at each other for who knows how long. Zhongli Jiju spent the day like a year, and finally reached out cautiously, took the belly band that was thrown beside the quilt, and put it around his neck. His face was red as if it was about to bleed. Ningqingyi turned her head and looked around, and found that Zhongli Jiju's hands were shaking and he couldn't even tie the string of his belly band, so he stood up and sat next to him, raising his hand to help. Ah dash! Zhongli Jiju suddenly panicked, holding her belly band with embarrassed eyes, and wanted to run away. No, I will do it myself. I'm a woman, what are you afraid of? I won't take advantage of Su Buletinling. Ningqingyi pretended not to care, and tied a bow with the red string. She noticed that there were red marks on the left and right sides of Zhongli Jiju's collarbone, and she frowned and touched it. Did he hit you? Zhongli Jiju really wanted to slap herself to death. She felt as if she was being executed in public, but there was nothing she could do. She couldn't explain that Su Buling had done it. He could only say in a low voice, "No, it was accidentally scratched." Oh! Ningqingyi was half convinced and earnestly helped Zhongli Jiju put away her clothes, then sat in front and continued to stare at him to prevent Zhongli Jiju from doing something stupid. Zhongli Jiju felt much better now that she had an extra layer of clothes on her body, but the embarrassment was not relieved much. She thought for a while. Qingyi, Su Buling and I are not just living together, we were trapped underground and thought we were going to die. He kept protecting me. I was moved and promised myself to him. It was considered a relationship. Happy. Ningqingyi blinked. That's good. I'm afraid that he will covet your beauty, or that you will rely on your beauty to seduce him. Zhongli Jiju saw that Ningqingyi's expression was normal, but she was still a little confused. Logically speaking, she would be jealous even if she found her man hanging out with a woman she didn't like, even if he wasn't angry. Ningqingyi's reaction was the same as that of a normal person, which was too abnormal. Zhongli Jiju thought for a moment, Qingyi, you are so angry. I thought you would get angry at me, or maybe you wouldn't be angry. Ningqingyi tilted her head slightly and thought about it for a moment, feeling that this was a compliment to her. Nodded. Love between men and women is a common thing in the world. When we were in Huainan, Su Buling Tian and Xiang what should I be angry about? He is really open-minded. He is worthy of being a disciple from Ningyu's teaching. He is cold on the outside and charming on the inside. Seeing that Ningqingyi didn't take this matter seriously, Zhongli Jiju felt a little better. After thinking about it, he said again. Well, that's the thing anyway, you just know it. From now on I will just call you sister. Call me sister? Ningqingyi suddenly became unhappy. You are older than me, why do you call me sister? Oh, by the way, you are in good terms now, and you and I are peers. If you really want to change your mind, just call me sister. Zhongli Jiju was stunned for a moment. Unexpectedly, Ningqingyi was not only open-minded, but also gave her the position of sister. This was too lovable. Zhongli Jiju was still embarrassed and ashamed, but there was still a bit of joy in her eyes. How embarrassing. Ningqingyi was confused. Before she could elaborate, she found that the window had been pushed open. The nightingale jumped in from outside and said urgently, "The people from the imperial court have gathered around. The young master asked you to take the jade seal and go west. Let's divert the pursuers. Pack your things and go downstairs. It's too late." Ning Qingyi's eyes narrowed slightly, and without any delay, she got up and went back to the house to get her baggage and weapons. The emergency situation also allowed Zhongli Jiju to recover a little. He quickly got up, took the package, and hurried downstairs. Su Buling and Zhongli Chuchu had arrived downstairs at the inn and fetched the horses from the stables. Zhongli Chuchu was sitting on Nightingale's horse, her face still a little lost. When she saw Ning Qingyi coming out of the inn, her eyes looked a little strange, but she didn't say much. Zhongli Jiju walked down the stairs with a small package on her back. When she saw the good disciple outside, her body visibly stiffened. She lowered her head and did not dare to look directly at him. But at this time, she could not delay, so she could only blush and ran out the door. Whispered, "Chuchu, I will explain to you when I calm down." Zhongli Chuchu clutched the hem of her skirt tightly, and the hundreds of emotions she had just suppressed came up again. She said, "Is there any explanation?" Then he drove his horse to catch the nightingale, who jumped down from the building and galloped out. "And go." Zhongli Jiju's face turned pale, but she didn't dare to cry out. She could only look at her husband for help. Su Buling was riding on the horse chasing the wind, with his long sword hanging on the side of the horse. He said calmly, "It's okay, Chu-Chu. You go to Taiyuan first and leave marks on the road. I will lead the pursuers farther away. Soon we will be here, I'll catch up. Let's go." Zhongli Jiju sighed lightly, not knowing what to say, so he could only keep up with Ning Qingyi's pace. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gongzi. Chapter 552. In the snow-covered fields, the wolf guards and officers and soldiers advanced half a mile away from the town and stopped advancing. They separated to the left and right, setting up their horses to block the intersection, and their crossbows were cocked and ready to go. Song Ying was dressed in black wolf guard clothes, holding a wild goose feather knife in her hand, looking at the dimly lit town in the distance, and asked her subordinates, "Are you sure you're in town?" The men next to him were also dressed in black, but there was a black hawk on their arm. They were the wolf guards of the arresting room who had just arrived from the field on Pegasus. The arrest room specializes in major and important cases, which is the department where Zhu Manzi worked at that time. It specializes in raising falcons and hounds, which are used to search for masters who have disappeared without a trace in the world. The source of the iron eagle hunting deer back then. It is also related to this group of spies who are good at hunting, and they are secretly called dog noses in the world. The wolf guard held the black eagle in his hand and pointed to the depths of the town. There is only one wind-chasing horse in Yuzhou. The three eagles have just swept across 100 miles of Yuzhou and only discovered the situation in this direction. If Prince Su, if he is running away on horseback, he must be here. Song Ying nodded and told the people around him, forbidden to make noise and fire, and quickly surround the surrounding area. If someone rushes into the cart and shoots an arrow to send a signal without asking his identity. Sidu Gong, you follow me into the town to declare the decree. If you dare not let me, I will. If you resist the order, you can be punished on the spot according to the law. Of course, don't kill him, just knock him down and capture him. Sidu Yuejin carried the 9-ring sword on his back, his strong body standing in the wind and snow, and sighed. Now that I'm here, I can naturally let Mr. Song arrange it, but I only want to beat people. King Su will investigate afterward. Don't worry, Lord Sidu. If King Su has any complaints, your Majesty will bear them. This matter is of great importance. As long as Su Buling is not beaten to death, there is nothing else to worry about. Song Ying waved her hand, telling the officers, soldiers, and wolf guards to disperse quickly, and then she and Sidu Yuejin sneaked into the town silently. But before the two of them left the side of the wolf guard, there was the sharp sound of arrows from the east, and a man's loud scolding. "That blind man dares to surround me. I am Prince Su. Do you want to rebel?" The voice was extremely angry, as if he was an innocent prince who spent the night in the town. When he woke up, he found that he was surrounded by people who didn't know the details and fled in a hurry. Song Ying stopped hastily and her face changed suddenly. "No, Su Buletinling wants to run away, stop him quickly." Hundreds of wolf guards and officers and soldiers lurking in the snow took action without being asked, carrying their swords and rushing toward the east for reinforcements. In an instant, the swords were as bright as snow in the wilderness, and the horses' hooves were running like thunder. You, why are there so many people? Get out quickly, get out quickly." Su Buling's shocked voice came again, and then there were the sounds of fierce horses neighing and galloping away into the distance, as well as the sounds of swords and soldiers clashing and officers and soldiers shouting. Sidu Yuejin felt something was wrong and said while running, "Master Song, it sounds like Prince Su was scared away by you." Song Ying didn't know the specific situation of Bodhi Island, but she knew that Su Buling must be acting, so that the court would not investigate later and find it difficult to explain why he saw the officers and soldiers fleeing. Su Buling ran away no matter what the reason was. As long as he ran away, there must be something wrong in his heart. So what if he didn't catch Su Buling's tail? As long as the imperial edict was read out in front of Su Buling, and Su Buling dared not to accept the edict, no matter how innocent he acted, it would be in vain. Song Ying got on his horse and chased toward the east. When he was more than a mile away, he shouted loudly, "I am Song Ying of the investigation department." The crown prince of Prince Su quickly dismounted and accepted the order. If he dares to resist the order, he will be punished as a serious crime of treason according to Daio law. Song Ying's voice was so loud that it almost shook the snow off the tree branches. Several war horses nearby were frightened. I'm afraid even those standing on the other side of the town could hear it clearly. But at this time, even if Su Buling could hear, he would pretend not to hear. How could he stop and accept the order honestly? In the east of the town, Su Buling took the lead with a long spear in his hand. He rode alone into the formation as if he were in an uninhabited country. More than 100 officers and soldiers had not completely blocked the road, so they could only hold spears or ride horses to block the way. Su Buling had little experience in dueling with the Grand Master, but he had learned battles from elementary school to high school. He was abandoned at the border when he was less than 10 years old. He hung out with the Ziliang cavalry all day long and had small-scale battles with the Northern Qi cavalry. More than 100 times, in terms of battlefield fighting, he is far more experienced than this group of temporarily transferred soldiers. It seems that the nickname of Little King of Hell was not given by himself. The wind and snow rolled across the wilderness, and Su Buling had a long spear in his hand like a dragon exploring the sea. He easily dismounted the cavalry who rushed to block him, and swept away the gun formation in front of him. Without any slowdown in the speed of his horse, he jumped directly from more than 200 officers and soldiers. He rushed over, his terrifying momentum made the officers and soldiers dare not stand directly in front to block him. Nightingale mounted her horse and followed Su Buling's pace. She also did not hold the reins. She held a long sword in each hand, and Kai Wushuan chopped down the soldiers on the left and right, and swept away the flying arrows. Zhongli Chuchu held Nightingale's waist with one hand, and the confused thoughts just now were temporarily suppressed by the chaotic scene. He looked around with concentration, holding a poisonous needle to check for leaks and fill in the gaps to help. They were just a group of ordinary officers and soldiers, and they could not do it alone. It can prevent death. Before she could see the situation clearly, the two horses had already passed the level. Su Buling heard Song Ying's shout, and naturally turned a deaf ear to it. He slowed down his horse and got behind Nightingale to prevent the stray arrow from accidentally injuring Choo Choo or the wolf guard expert from attacking. During the run, a horse's belly came to hide, and the roadside was blocked. The crossbowmen were ordered to catch them, snatch the iron bow and arrow kettle from the panicked and shouting crossbowmen, and hang them on the weapon hooks. Stop him! Fire the arrow! There was constant noise behind them, and a mess of infantry chased them for a few steps and then stopped, leaving only a dozen or so light cavalrymen chasing wildly. It's just that the horses of the Yuzhu frontier army came from Liaodong, and the light cavalry was still wearing iron armor, no matter how light it was. Su Buling and Nightingale were riding in the wind, riding on the snow, and were traveling lightly. The speed difference was too big, but they were able to leave the frontier troops a stone's throw away in just 1 mile. Songying and Sidu Yuejin are both top heroes who have traveled around the world for many years. Their weapons are used to kill people, and their mounts are used to protect their lives. The mounts and weapons are equally important, and their horses are naturally good, although they are not as good as the one in 1,000. It's hard to match the horse chasing the wind, but Su Buling can't leave the Nightingale behind and run away, so he only needs to catch up with the horse riding the snow. Songying held the long sword in his hand and galloped to catch up. When the small town behind him disappeared, only Sidu Yuejin was left beside him. Sidu Yuejin has been famous in the world for decades. He is experienced in both escaping and chasing. After glancing at the dust in the distance, he said, "You can catch up in about 3 miles. Be careful of the rabbit kicking the eagle." The rabbit kicks the eagle is the moment when the falcon pounces on the rabbit and lands on the ground. The rabbit turns over and kicks with its powerful hind legs, which symbolizes a desperate counterattack. Songying has been chasing the wanted criminals of Jiazi in the rivers and lakes all year round. Naturally, he does not need to be reminded about this. He stares at the 2 horses in the distance with all his attention. He whips the whip in his hand a few times and speeds up the horse again. Tap tap tap. The crisp sound of horse hooves echoed through the snowy night. Zhongli Chuchu was sitting behind Nightingale. There were no officers, soldiers, or arrows around, so he had time to look back. However, he saw 2 horses in the distance that he couldn't get rid of, and they were getting closer and closer. He couldn't help but said nervously, "Mr. Su, what should I do?" Su Buling knew that Songying and Sidu Yuejin were behind him. If they were caught up, he and Nightingale obviously had little chance of winning. He immediately hung his long spear on the side of the horse and opened his arms. "Jump over here. My horse is better. Let's lighten Nightingale's load." Zhongli Chuchu is very tall. She has breasts and legs and her weight cannot be too light. She weighs about 100 pounds no matter what. Nightingale, on the other hand, is slender, probably weighing less than 80 pounds. Riding a horse alone is not much different from running without any weight, and the speed will naturally be faster. Zhongli Chuchu didn't hesitate, quickly turned around on his horse, and with one leap, he landed on Su Buling's horse, hitting him full in the chest. Su Buling hugged Zhongli Chuchu, and the 2 sat face to face on the horse. He did not bother to ask Chuchu to turn around, but warned, "Watch the back, I will find an opportunity to get rid of them." Nuanke Literature Network. The posture of the 2 of them is very strange, just like those sitting on lotuses. Zhongli Chuchu put his chin on Su Buling's shoulder and stared at the blurry snowy night behind him. The horse was jolting, and he was hugged by the waist so tightly that even the skirt of his clothes was piled up and turned into 2 flat balls. The situation was critical. Zhongli Chuchu was attracted by the current situation. He even put aside the matter of catching someone in bed and didn't pay attention to these physical contacts at all. "But there is nothing to see if you chase me." Kayang's nose is close to Su Buling's long hair, and the faint fragrance spreads from Su Buling's neck and hair to the tip of Zhongli's beautiful nose. The fragrance is very special and unique in the world. Zhongli Jeju researches everything by himself, and the powder he uses is the same. Zhongli Chuchu has been smelling it since he was a child, and he couldn't be more familiar with it. Zhongli Chuchu's eyes were slightly dazed for a moment, and he was temporarily absent-minded under the impact of the fragrance. Is this what he and Master were like just now? How could this be possible? Zhongli Chuchu's body suddenly stiffened, and then moved back, wanting to be farther away from Su Buling. Su Buling didn't know why, and was afraid that Zhongli Chuchu would fall, so he hugged Chuchu's waist like a water snake with all his strength, and warned, "Chuchu, don't move, we are running away." Zhongli Chuchu's struggling movements froze, and he was brought back to reality. He gritted his teeth and leaned on Su Buling's shoulder again. I wanted to clear away the messy thoughts in my mind, but messy pictures appeared in my mind involuntarily. Just like I am holding him now, Master is sitting in Su Buling's arms, the two of them. Maybe Buletinling also thinks it smells good. Master's smiling face and Su Buling's face were intertwined, as if they could hear each other's laughter and gasps. Indescribable emotions hit my mind, but I couldn't avoid it. I could only smell the unfamiliar fragrance and helplessly endure this psychological devastation. Zhongli Chuchu couldn't restrain himself anymore and didn't move. She lay on Su Buling's shoulder. Tears filled her eyes and rolled down silently. Su Buling couldn't see Chuchu's face, nor did he notice that Chuchu was crying again. He hugged Chuchu and asked her to sit firmly. He glanced at Nohara in front of him, found a mound, and said, "Nightingale, left." The nightingale who was walking in front quickly turned around and rushed into the fields without asking. He quickly ran across the snowfield and jumped over the mound. Su Buling followed closely behind, and after crossing the mound, he took off his iron bow, said, "Chuchu, sit tight," then turned around and opened the bow, aiming at the mound behind. The three-stone iron bow was so powerful that it could hit the stones without clusters. Ordinary archers could not pull it open at all. Only the elite crossbowmen of the frontier army could use this thing. It was for this reason that Su Buletinling snatched the bow. However, the three-stone bow was still too light for Su Buletinling's strength. He bent the bow like a full moon without making any forceful movements, and the iron tire bow collapsed to the limit. Whether you are a soldier or a child of an aristocratic family, riding and archery is a compulsory course. In the army, it is even more important than personal martial arts. Su Buling's archery skills have naturally been practiced since he was a child. It has been shown once that it basically shoots wherever it is within the range. The two sides were about 200 steps apart, and because of the uplift of the earthen mound, they temporarily lost each other's trace. The chasing Songying found Su Buling jumping into the field, and he squeezed his horse's belly and rushed out of the official road. His eyes were as sharp as an eagle and locked onto Su Buling's back. After Su Buling crossed the earthen mound, he listened to the movement behind the earthen mound. Sidu Yuejin narrowed his eyes slightly, took out the 9-ring broadsword from his back, and said in a deep voice, "Be careful of fraud. The horse has not stopped, keep chasing." Songying replied in a deep voice, and rushed up the earthen mound. However, just as Songying poked his head out from above the earthen mound, a sharp sound of breaking wind came from the crosswind. Songying and Sidu Yuejin's faces changed at the same time. They didn't expect Su Buling to shoot an arrow in the dark. Having already rushed out of the earthen mound, the huge inertia of the horse and the man could not stop, and the two instinctively ducked to avoid the flying arrows. But Su Buling was also a martial arts champion. He knew that one arrow could not do anything to a master-level expert. He could rely on muscle memory to dodge by hearing the sound. The feather arrow that Su Buling shot out of his bow was not aimed at Songying on the horse, but at the fierce horse that had just jumped out of the mound and exposed its 4 hooves. The sharp arrowhead had a little cold light and flew almost close to the snow on the mound, and the place where it landed was exactly the bowl-sized horse hoof that was about to fall. No matter how inhuman the martial arts champion's reaction was, it was his own martial arts. He couldn't train the horse under his crotch to be able to hear the sound and identify the position and step on the snow without leaving any trace. This arrow with a full string would definitely pass through the horse's legs if it hit, and even the best horse would have to lie down on the spot. Without a horse, chasing the snow-trampling horse with 2 legs, you can imagine that you can't catch up even if you die of exhaustion. Song Ying reacted very quickly. He realized something was wrong when he heard the sound. He didn't use a long weapon like a lance. He could only unsheath a goose feather knife on his waist and throw it out at the moment when the horse jumped over the mound. The speed of the blade was comparable to that of a strong crossbow, and he accurately intercepted the feather arrow halfway. Swish! The forehooves of the flying horse had not yet landed on the ground, and 3 string sounds followed one after another. When Song Ying intercepted the first arrow, the next 3 feather arrows had already broken through the air. They were standard continuous arrows, aiming at the 4 legs of the horse. Few people in the martial arts world use arrows, and this scene shocked Sidu Yuejin. Song Ying's eyes showed a bit of astonishment. He had been dealing with people in the martial arts world for many years, and he obviously didn't have many opportunities to appreciate this kind of fighting method. Seeing 3 feather arrows attacking at the same time, Song Ying gritted his teeth and flew out from the horse's back, grabbing the feather arrows with both hands in the air, and sweeping away the last one with 1 foot. But in this way, he also fell on the snow. After Song Ying landed, the horses brushed past him. He did not remount his horse, but shouted, "Sidu Gong, you ride 2 horses to chase, I will follow." One person riding 2 or 3 horses is a more luxurious way of fighting in the cavalry. Riding 2 horses alternately, there is basically no opponent that cannot be caught up. Sidu Yuejin nodded, and while galloping on his horse, he grabbed the reins of Song Ying's mount with his left hand and hung it on the hook on the side of the horse. The feather arrows attacked again, and Sidu Yuejin turned over and hung on the side of the horse. With the length of the 4-foot broadsword, he accurately used the tip of the knife to pick up the arrows shot at the horse's legs. Turning left and right, his mind was flowing, and his riding skills were obviously rare in the world. Seeing this, Su Buling did not waste any more feather arrows, put away his bow and arrows, and continued to run eastward with Nightingale. Song Ying watched the 4 horses go away one after another, spit, put away the goose feather knife, and shot a communication firework towards the sky. After waiting for a while, the wolf guards caught up. Song Ying ordered some of the wolf guards to dismount, and then led his elite subordinates, each with 3 horses, to chase after Su Buling, who had already disappeared. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 553. The snowy winter night made it difficult to stay outdoors. In addition, the border was too close, so the people would not choose to settle down here. There was no place to rest and take shelter from the wind for more than 10 miles in the suburbs. Chen Daozai, who was dubbed the Wudang god of killing, stopped by the river with his horse. His internal injuries had not healed, and his complexion looked a little weak, but it was common to travel with injuries, so he did not show any discomfort. Zhang Buhan, who changed into the clothes of a man of the world, let the horse drink water by the river, and looked up at the boundless wilderness. The wolf guards came out of Yuzhu in full force, and all directions were blocked. If Su Buling escaped, there would be movement just now. I saw the wolf guards rushing here. Song Ying and Sidu Yuejin led the team. They must have discovered Su Buling's whereabouts. If we follow them, we will definitely find him. Chen Daozai had been stranded in Yuzhu for so long and was injured. In fact, he didn't want to fight anymore, but such words were obviously impossible to say. Song Ying just wants to capture Su Buling and interrogate him about the whereabouts of the Jade Seal. He dare not let Su Buling die. If he acts in front of them, they will certainly stop him. It is not easy to act. Find an opportunity to act from the dark, but once you act, you can't make any mistakes. If you act and don't kill Su Buling, our identities will be exposed, and I'm afraid you won't be safe in this life. Chen Daizai naturally knew this truth. He had already made a mortal enemy with Su Buling. If Su Buling didn't die, he would definitely launch a bloody revenge when Su Buling returned to Suzhou safely. It may not be possible to send troops to flatten Wudang Mountain, but assassinations will never stop. The number of retainers kept by the king of Su is no less than that of the king of Chu. The two men rested for a while by the river. Before the horses finished drinking water, Zhang Buhan's ears moved slightly and his eyes looked to the northeast several miles away. It was dark in the snowy night, and the scenery 30 steps away was not clear. The sound of the wind and the sound of the river mixed together, greatly interfering with hearing. Zhang Buhan listened carefully, distinguishing the subtle movements in the wind, and raised his hand. Is there the sound of horse hooves? Chen Daizai also noticed it, leaned over, put his ear to the ground and listened carefully, and nodded after a moment. There are horses passing from the east. The distance is too far to hear how many horses, but they are very fast. It is impossible for anyone to travel in the wind and snow in the middle of the night. It is probably the wolf guard chasing Su Buling. Go and have a look. After a brief exchange, the two of them jumped on the horse and galloped towards the east. Tap tap. The horseshoes stepped on the frozen mud and made a crisp sound. After running for dozens of miles, no matter how good the horse was, it was impossible to maintain full speed. It was already several times slower than the initial sprint, and it was more like running fast in the snow. The wind-chasing horse's heavy breathing and heartbeats were like drums, and the sweat was blown away by the cold wind in the snowy night. Sidu Yuejin in the back was still chasing him. Although one person and two horses could greatly increase the endurance, they could not avoid the consumption of horsepower. After chasing so far, they could not catch up. The horses were almost at their limit and could only hang on the back and could not sprint again. Zhongli Chuchu still put her chin on Su Buling's shoulder and stared at the pursuers behind. Just now, she was sad and crying, but after running for dozens of miles, her back was hurt by the biting cold wind, and her chaotic thoughts were frozen away. Maybe she couldn't hold on a little, so she leaned closer to Su Buling's arms without making a sound. Her waist was hugged by a strong arm, and the horses were bumpy and rubbing against each other. In order to meet Su Buling at night in the inn, Zhongli Chuchu dressed very beautifully. The skirt on her body was also a simple red single skirt, thin and transparent. You can imagine what effect this friction would have. The chest was pressed tightly against Su Buling, and Su Buling could even feel the tiny bulge like a peanut. With the bump of the horse's hooves, it tended to harden a little, and the temperature of the beauty in his arms also rose a little. Riding a horse to shake off the pursuers, Su Buling paid close attention to the surrounding road conditions. Although he noticed it, he didn't think about it. Zhongli Chuchu couldn't do that. She was originally thinking about the appearance of her master and Su Buling when they were intimate. As her mind calmed down, the physical feelings began to surge in her heart. Once she noticed these, she couldn't stop it. The instinct of her body was not something she could control at all. Riding on a horse face to face, hugging each other, what kind of sitting posture is self-evident. Zhongli Chuchu's clothes rubbed back and forth on Su Buling's chest, and the inner side of her legs was almost the same. After more than 10 miles, the ice-clean jade girl should have been worn soft, not to mention that Zhongli Chuchu was not a woman who ate cold meals. Fortunately, the biting cold wind behind her could keep people awake. Although Zhongli Chuchu was a little unnatural, she could bear it. However, Su Buling noticed that Chuchu was being blown by the cold wind from behind, so he pulled a blanket for camping from the side of the horse and wrapped it around Chuchu to block the cold wind. With the blanket wrapped around his back, the biting cold disappeared, leaving only the warmth around him and the strong masculine smell. Zhongli Chuchu was able to suppress the discomfort in his body with the biting cold just now, but when he warmed up, he immediately felt something was wrong. After holding on for a while, he found that he had an unreasonable chest tightness, his cheeks were getting hotter and hotter, there seemed to be beads of sweat on his forehead, and there was a little hot under his clothes. Zhongli Chuchu felt a little itchy and subconsciously wanted to twist a few times, but he was afraid of disturbing Su Buling, so he could only bite his teeth and endure it secretly. But the longer it lasted, the stronger the feedback was, and even his head was a little dizzy. Several times he almost forgot that he was getting rid of the pursuers. Huff. The woman's breath was as fragrant as orchid, and her slightly rapid breathing was heard from time to time, and the subtle fragrance came from her bosom. Su Buling was concentrating on choosing the route. As they were so close to each other, he gradually discovered that something was wrong with Chuchu. His arms around her waist were almost soaked with sweat. He felt like he was holding a hot water bottle. The places his hands touched were very moist, like water tofu, and they were rubbing against him gently. Su Buling blinked his eyes, showing some surprise. He didn't expect Chuchu to be moved in this situation. However, he couldn't respond at this time, so he said in a slightly strange way. Chuchu? Chuchu? Oh. Zhongli Chuchu suddenly woke up, and the arm around Su Buling loosened a little. He looked back and said. There is still half a mile to go, and we haven't caught up yet. While speaking, his breath was unstable, and there was a bit of confusion in his green eyes, as if he was wondering what was wrong with him. Su Buling didn't know what to say. Although Chuchu had an exotic face that brought disaster to the country and the people, and her figure had long been mature, she was only a little girl of 17 or 18 after all, and it was normal for her to have uncontrollable reactions. He just pretended not to notice and continued to ride his horse at full speed. After running so far, Nightingale's snow-riding horse was obviously almost at the limit of its physical strength. If it continued to run, it would be exhausted to death. At this time, it was far away from the Dehe mountain area. It was dark and there were no landmarks. It was unclear where it ran to. The surrounding fields disappeared, and there were more mountains. There were many trees with fallen branches and leaves growing on the mountains, which looked like peach trees. Nightingale's horse slowed down and looked back at Situyuejin, who was chasing him half a mile away, and said, "Sir, one person and two horses are chasing. If we compete with endurance, we will definitely not be able to outrun them. We will definitely be caught up. What should we do now?" If Nightingale's horse died of exhaustion, 3 people riding on one horse would not be able to get rid of the unknown number of wolf guards behind them. Su Buling thought for a moment, and seeing that Song Ying and the wolf guards were thrown to some unknown place, leaving only Situyuejin, he said. "You go first and hide somewhere. I'll deal with Situyuejin before I leave." He then lifted the blanket, held Zhongli Chuchu's waist with both hands, and threw her directly onto Nightingale's horse. Zhongli Chuchu's expression had recovered. Although too many things happened tonight, she knew the priorities clearly. Landing behind Nightingale, she hugged Nightingale and turned back to warn her in a hurry. "Mr. Su, don't be so stubborn, be careful." Nightingale felt something was wrong with Chuchu, she was wet and hot, and thought that the young master didn't forget to touch the girl when he ran away. She felt a little strange, but as a maid, she couldn't say anything about this, so she just turned back to warn her. Situyuejin has been famous for a long time, following the external family's way, and his signature skill is the 28 continuous knives, which is a burst of energy, then a second and a third, and then a third. If you can block it, you can fight. If you can't block it, you must not force it, otherwise you will definitely lose. The disadvantage of having too many records in the martial arts world is that it is easy to be studied by the opponent. Situyuejin has been rampaging in the martial arts world for nearly 30 years, and he has shown all the martial arts moves he has learned, and everyone who has been passed on by the storyteller knows it. If it were any other master, such as Zulu, once his unique skill shaking the mountain was shown, his opponent would be on guard, and it would be difficult for him to achieve the effect of a one-hit kill when facing an opponent of the same level. And Sidu Ejin's strength lies in the fact that everyone in the martial arts world knows his martial arts routines, but his swordsmanship is simple and straightforward, and there is no way to break his moves except to resist. Since he came out of the mountain, no one in the martial arts world can hold on until the 28 chain knives are finished. The highest record is 10 years ago, when the Mobei swordsman Yang Ju Ni blocked Sidu Ejin's 19 swords and escaped at the cost of one arm. Few other people who fought against him could withstand 9 swords in front of the Taiji Hall. Sidu Yu made 13 consecutive swords, which forced Zhou Yizi, who was much stronger than him, to use unconventional methods to deal with it, which shows how great his killing power is. Su Buling had heard of the name of the knife master, and there was no disdain in his eyes. He raised his hand and asked Yang and Zhongli Chuchu to continue to gallop away. The horse under his crotch did not stop. When they turned around the forest, they flew behind a peach tree beside the road, ready to go. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 554. The peach blossom sea stretching for nearly 100 miles is rarely visited by people. There are no lights between the mountains. There is only endless snow in the surrounding areas, and peach trees covered with snowflakes are scattered in between. Go! The flying horse hooves brought up the mud and snow on the ground, and the strong wind swept away the snowflakes. The peach branches extending from the mountain wall sway gently in the snowy night. Sidu Ejin held the 9 rings knife and switched back and forth between the 2 horses flexibly. His tiger-like eyes were fixed on the traces of the 2 horses in front. However, it was a dark and snowy night, and even the road ahead was difficult to identify. All that could be seen were 2 shadows. After chasing for an unknown number of miles, Su Buling in front turned around a mountain forest and temporarily lost his trace, but the sound of horse hooves could still be heard in his ears, and he continued to run forward. Sidu Ejin is the number 1 in Tianese woolen. Everyone knows the reputation of old Sidu. He has been in the martial arts world for decades. He has a hot temper and often conflicts with others, but he does not look down on others because he is the leader of the sword. It is obviously not bad to be too cautious in the martial arts world. The higher the martial arts, the more cautious you should be. People who rely on martial arts and are careless will basically not live to the level of a master. Although there was nothing unusual in front, Sidu Ejin still played up his guard and hid between the 2 horses to avoid being attacked by arrows. Holding the sword in his right hand, he did not use his eyes to look ahead, but used his ears to carefully distinguish the subtle movements around him. Tap tap tap. The horses galloped and soon ran through the mountains and forests, revealing the road. The 2 black shadows in front were still galloping away, and there was no intention of stopping to attack. Sidu Ejin let down his guard a little, and was about to get on the horse and continue chasing, when he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. Ha! A thunderous roar suddenly exploded beside the road. Snow foam flew across the sky, and the cold light was like snow. Sidu Ejin looked to the side with his peripheral vision, and saw a white figure rising into the sky in the dim peach forest, and his hand slipped on the tail of the dragon-patterned long spear, and directly chopped the long spear down. The force was so great that the fine long spear was pressed into a strong bow with full tension, shaped like a crescent moon. The 2-foot-long spear tip made a terrifying sound of breaking wind, and drew an arc in the wind and snow, with the momentum of Mount Tai pressing down on the top, unstoppable. Sidu Ejin had heard of Su Buling's fighting power a long time ago, and he was not careless in his heart. When the terrifying momentum came, he narrowed his wrinkled eyes slightly, raised the heavy 9-ring knife and swept to the side. Dang! The loud sound of metal and iron clashing was like thunder in the snowy night, and the sparks splashed were like lightning, instantly illuminating the surrounding area of several feet. The lance fell on the 9-ring heavy sword, and the huge force made the warhorse let out a long and shrill neigh. The lumbar vertebrae under the saddle sank significantly, and then the forehooves staggered and fell to the ground. Sidu-Ejin's body was hanging on the side of the horse, and it was difficult to use the force. The long lance fell down. Although the arm holding the sword did not move, the body could not stabilize in this situation. It was directly crushed and broke the leather buckle of the saddle and fell to the road. Su Buling's long lance did not stop the attack because of the 9-ring sword's blocking. After hitting Sidu-Ejin with a full force, it continued to fall without losing momentum. The lance fell on Sidu-Ejin's mount, and the 2-foot lance tip fell on the saddle of the empty horse opposite. Cha! A cold light flashed in the snowy night, and 2 shrill long neighs sounded at the same time. The spear with great force broke the horse's spine, and the 2-foot spear tip was like a knife into butter, easily slicing into the horse's back. If the first horse hadn't stopped the spear, it would have broken the horse next to it in two. The 2 horses fell to the ground at the same time, thrown 2 feet away, with blood and internal organs scattered all over the ground. Zhongli Chuchu, who was holding Nightingale in front, was originally worried about Su Buling's safety. Seeing this, all the messy thoughts were swept away, and her eyes were full of shock. My God, Sidu-Ejin is dead. Nightingale's expression was calm. He's not dead. This is nothing. Tang Jiazhuang's beating of Songying and Jiagongong is really powerful. Hurry up and find a place to hide. And Sidu-Ejin, who fell off his horse, was shocked by this terrifying blow even though he had expected it. His body was hit to the ground by Su Buling's spear. Before he landed, Sidu-Ejin used his left hand to support the frozen snow, used one arm to support his body, bent to release the force and then suddenly straightened, bounced his body off the road, raised his hand and slashed at Su Buling who had just landed. This time, the force was not in the right posture, and it was too hasty, so the force was not strong. After Su Buling raised his spear and easily blocked it, he retreated to the side of the road and ran back to the Zufeng horse. Now that Sidu-Ejin's horse was killed, Sidu-Ejin could not catch up with his legs alone. If he could get away, there would be no need to waste time to fight head-on. Want to run? Sidu-Ejin was born with a bad temper. He was reluctant to work for the court, but he was angry after being tricked like this. How could he let Su Buling take the opportunity to escape? He raised his blade and pounced on Su Buling's back like a tiger. Grandmaster level masters, no matter how good their Qinggong is, have the best explosive power in the world at close range. They can basically reach within 30 steps in the blink of an eye. Without this ability, they can't get close to others, and they can't be called grandmasters. The blade attacked from behind, and Su Buling saw that he couldn't escape, so he turned around and swept Sidu-Ejin with a sweeping blow, shouting angrily. Sidu-Ejin, you are so bold. You dare to assassinate the son of a vassal king, do you know what crime you should be punished for? Fighting is fighting, but the play still has to be performed. Su Buling's face was furious, as if he was an innocent prince who was assassinated. Sidu-Ejin blocked the long spear with his sword, flipped his body and came to the front of Su Buling, saying loudly. The emperor has ordered you to surrender your weapons immediately and obey his orders. If you dare to disobey the order, you will be punished for treason. When Su Buling heard this, he stopped for a moment and looked half believing and half doubting. Where is the imperial edict? Sidu-Ejin walked briskly with the 9-ring knife in his hand, but he choked and looked at the direction he was looking at, and said angrily. The imperial edict is in the hands of Lord Song. You don't have the imperial edict, and you dare to fake it? Do you want to rebel? Su Buling knew that Sidu-Ejin couldn't have the imperial edict. After saying the polite words, he raised his hand and stabbed Sidu-Ejin's middle door with a spear. Sidu-Ejin had nothing to say. If he couldn't explain it clearly, he couldn't explain it clearly. Anyway, he had seen the imperial edict. If there was something wrong, the emperor would take it. He was just a thug. Seeing that Su Buling didn't listen to his advice, Sidu Yuejin had no reservations. The 9-ring knife in his hand was as agile as a butterfly, leaning towards the long spear. The Qinrenmen 9-ring knife is a unique school of its own. It is famous for its heavy blade and 9 copper rings on the back of the blade. The normal 9-ring knife weighs 32 pounds and is about 4 feet long. When swung, it is like a windmill fan blade. Anyone who touches it will die within a foot. Even if they are wearing heavy armor, they will be directly crushed to death by the heavy blade. It can be said to be unstoppable. The 9-ring knife in Sidu Yuejin's hand is more than 4 feet long. It is already flush with the ribs when it is stuck on the ground. The 9 weighted copper rings on the back of the knife have been replaced with iron rings cast from fine iron. It is obviously heavier than the common ones. It is probably difficult for ordinary people to even hold it with one hand. Such a heavy knife, held in Sidu Yuejin's hand, is no different from a thin long sword. There is no sluggishness in the movement due to the weight. The use of the iron ring on the back of the 9-ring knife is to increase the chopping force with weight, and to block the enemy's weapon, thereby breaking the long sword, the tip of the gun, etc. Sidu Yuejin has a big temper and a big body, but his martial arts are not rough at all. While deftly picking up the spear tip with a heavy long sword, he accurately put the iron ring on the sharp spear tip, and then held the sword with both hands, turned around and twisted it fiercely, using the signature method of the Sidu family, the sword-breaking style. After putting the weapon on, Sidu Yuejin's eyes sank, his body leaned forward, and his hands exerted force at the same time, and the dragon-patterned long spear was bent in an instant. The fastest update mobile version. But the dragon-patterned long spear is a national treasure of Dachi. If it is broken like this, it would be too much of an underestimation of Dachi's metallurgical technology. Su Buling's long spear was stuck in the iron ring and was difficult to pull out. The moment the amazing force came from his hands, he twisted the spear shaft and cut the iron ring with the blade of the spear tip, and then his feet suddenly reacted and twisted his body in the same way. Both sides were martial arts masters who crushed everyone with their strength. When they exerted their strength at the same time, the fine quality spear shaft was directly broken into a circle, like a fold, but it did not break. This time, both sides used all their strength, their muscles were erected, their foreheads were bulging with blue veins, and the ground where they landed was stepped into 4 pits, but they did not move at all, and no one could do anything to the other. However, no matter how good the 9-ring knife in Sidu Yuejin's hand was, it was not as good as the long spear water dragon. The stalemate lasted only a moment, and the iron ring that stuck to the spear tip was cut off by the spear tip that could cut iron like mud under the huge force of both sides. Ding! After a crisp sound, Sidu Yuejin's heavy knife suddenly chopped out. The long spear in Su Buling's hand instantly straightened, but did not stop there. It circled behind him. At the moment of straightening, he held the spear with both hands and chopped at Sidu Yuejin's left shoulder. The iron ring broke and the blade chopped to the right, and the left shoulder naturally revealed a flaw. No matter if it was a master or a weakling, if a move was broken, it would inevitably put him in a passive position, otherwise it would not be called a broken move. Su Buling's reaction was surprisingly fast, and he seized this opportunity with keenness. Who of those who could reach the realm of a master is a mediocre one? The sharp spear tip swept over, and Sidu Yuejin reacted without any delay. He immediately dragged the knife with one hand, turned around, and the heavy blade in his hand was like a fan leaf, directly slashing at Su Buling's head with the force of splitting the mountain. He did not defend at all, and used Sidu Yuejin's famous skill, the 28-way chain knife. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 555. The 28-way chain knife is famous for its powerful force and fearlessness. It is a standard life-for-life move. The 28 knives are linked together, and each knife is heavier than the last due to the effect of inertia. There is a saying that the 28 knives can split a mountain. Su Buling swept the long spear in his hand towards Sidu Yuejin's back. If Sidu Yuejin was wearing a back armor and breastplate, he might not be killed if he was hit. And the 9-ring heavy knife weighing dozens of kilograms would still smash the head into the chest cavity if it hit the head with an iron helmet. There is no way to break the move except to block it. Su Buling turned his hand and raised the long spear horizontally without hesitation, and used the spear pole to block the heavy knife that was swung in a circle. There was a loud clang sound, and the spear pole was visibly bent a little. Sidu Yuejin has been using the 9-ring knife since he was 3 years old, and has become the contemporary martial arts champion from a young man. He has wielded it from the coast of Tianese to the northern desert of Yuzhou. With nearly 50 years of experience, he is no child playing around. With one knife, the brute force poured out. Su Buling's arms were like jade pillars that held up the sky, and his white boots were smashed into the mud. Ding ding. The essence of the 28-way chain knife is the word chain. The blade is like a tide, flowing endlessly without a pause. The first knife falls and the second knife starts. There is no fancy fake moves. It seems simple, but it is the best knife method in the contemporary world. Even Zhang Xiang, who loves knives like crazy, showed enthusiasm and unattainable colors after seeing it. Su Buling took the knife, and he had no time to change his moves and counterattack. The second knife fell on the spear, followed by the third and fourth knives. In the peach blossom forest in the distance, Nightingale and Zhongli Chuchu found a snow nest to hide in, paying attention to the surrounding movements while also paying attention to the battle situation. Seeing Su Buling suddenly fall into a passive position, Nightingale's face changed slightly. It's bad, the young master was taken away. Sidu Yuejin's life in exchange for his life is to force the young master to switch from offense to defense, and this defense can't be counterattacked. Zhongli Chuchu didn't understand this level of confrontation at all, and said anxiously, "What should we do? The 28 swords are linked together. Either you counterattack after receiving it, or you can't receive it halfway and withdraw with serious injuries." All the martial arts masters in the past years have been defeated by this hand. So far, no one has been able to break the move. Sidu Yuejin's sword can't be blocked at all. Nightingale's words were obviously not heard from the storyteller. Many guests in the Su Palace naturally study the heroes of the world when they practice martial arts on a daily basis, and have analyzed contemporary martial arts masters. Among them, the one with the most routines is Jia Gong's 1000-layer miasma, which is combined with gold silk and body movements, with endless changes, making people unable to defend against. The simplest one is the Sidu family's chain knife, which is just 28 axes. It will chop you openly, just like the heavy cavalry charging the battle formation. It doesn't matter what you do, just rely on hard power to crush you. If you can block it, you can beat it. If you can't block it, you will be crushed. When the disciples of Qin Renmin fight with others, most of them fight very quickly, relying on the unparalleled explosive power of the 9-ring knife to push people to death in one wave. This simple and direct knife method is very useless in the early stage of practice. It depends on the courage of fearlessness. Many masters can dodge or catch it, but when the knife is so fast that no one in the world can dodge it, it will break out of the cocoon and become a butterfly, which will undergo a qualitative change. If you can't dodge it, you can only block it. If you can block it, you will live, but if you can't block it, you will die. It's simple and direct, and there is no way to deal with it. And there is no one in the world who can resist Sidu Yuejin's 28 knives. Ding ding ding. Sparks flew in the snowy night. Sidu Yuejin's tall body spun like the wind. His robes fluttered and rolled up the snow between heaven and earth. The heavy 9-ring knife in his hand was so fast that only a shadow was left. The sound of the iron rings knocking against each other was like a bell being shaken vigorously. One knife after another fell on the dragon-patterned spear. Su Buling supported the ground behind him with his right foot, raised his long spear horizontally to block, and chopped down 9 times in a row. The whole person slid back a distance. The tiger's mouth holding the spear cracked and oozing blood. If the spear was moved away, the blade would fall on his head, and he couldn't change his moves at all. In the past, Sidu Yuejin usually solved the problem with 3 knives. Those who could let him use 9 knives were rare masters in the world. Seeing that Su Buling could still crouch after 9 knives, he did not hold back any more strength in his hand. With a roar, the heavy blade smashed down brazenly. Bang! This time was much more rude than the previous small fight. Su Buling's arms and shoulders made a slight sound, his feet sank deeply into the mud, his face flushed, and he quickly took a step back when he saw the spear bending and hitting his body. Once the body moved, the lower body would inevitably be unstable, and it would be difficult to stand after this movement. The 28 consecutive swords were linked together, leaving no chance for the opponent to breathe. Sidu Yuejin's sword fell, and the second sword was raised and fell on the horizontal spear again. Su Buling's feet could no longer take root in the ground. He sighed and retreated step by step. Occasionally, he stepped on the stones on the ground, and was shattered by the power transmitted from his body in an instant. There were knife marks on the fine spear. In order to prevent the bending from being too serious and the blade falling on his head, he could only hold his hands closer and block the heavy blade with a gap of more than 1 foot. The 9-ring knife chopped down, and the blade itself brought a heavy blow. After landing on the spear, the 8 weighted iron rings hit the back of the knife under the action of inertia, which would bring another hidden force like an inch punch. Such high-intensity and high-intensity continuous slashing is a great test of the bearing capacity of muscles and bones of both parties. If it were an ordinary person, I am afraid that his arms would be broken by now. Su Buling's arms were almost unconscious. As long as he bent, he would be pressed by the huge force and could no longer hold up. He could only force his arms to straighten and let the force on the blade pass along his arms, waist, abdomen, legs and feet until it was unloaded on the ground. Clang clang clang. Sidu Yuejin seemed to be attacking with force and calculation, but his sharp eyes slowly showed fear. After all, he has been traveling around the world for decades, and this is the first time he has encountered such a tough opponent. In the blink of an eye, the 18 swords fell, and it was true that Su Buling was retreating steadily, but he did not lose any sense of control when retreating. He even paid attention not to let the blade hit the same place on the pole, so as not to break the pole and leave him defenseless. You must know that when Yang Ju-ni was the number 1 swordsman in Mobei, after 15 blows, Yang Ju-ni's mouth was full of blood and his hands were bleeding profusely. The last 4 blows struck Yang Ju-ni, causing Yang Ju-ni's back of the sword to hit his chest again and again. He had no choice but to escape sideways without losing his left arm. This guy's bones are made of iron, right? By this time of the fight, Sidu Yuejin had completely forgotten the original intention of coming and why the fight started. There are no other distractions when drawing the sword, it is all based on the sharp energy of Wu Wu second. Clang. The 19th knife fell. Sidu Yuejin had only struck 19 blows at most in his fights with others. In the past, he would always lament that he could not use up all the skills he had learned. The blade of the knife was like a mountain, hitting the pole full of knife marks. Su Buling groaned and took 3 steps back, but still did not lose his balance and fall down, with a bit of fanaticism in his eyes. Ah! Sidu Yuejin's beard and hair were all spread out, and his face was as furious as a burning flame. The brief shock had been suppressed, and all that was left was that the martial artist was brave and ruthless and did not believe in evil. Even the precautions originally used to prevent the opponent from taking the time to counter-attack have been given up. Instead, he holds the knife in both hands, swings it round and strikes, completely exchanging lives for lives without any scruples. Dang dang dang. 20, 21, 23. It was probably the first time that the 3 swords fell in front of people. Su Buletin doubled the pressure and fell backwards. Sidu Yuejin's serial sword had already predicted the opponent's situation, and without giving Su Buling time to stabilize, he flew forward and landed again with the sword. Bang! Su Buletin tilted his body and raised the pole to block the blade. He had nowhere to use his body, and his whole body was smashed to the ground, creating a dent. Dang dang block. 25, 26, 27. Sidu Yuejin's movements were not slow at all, but he was already panting like an ox, sweating profusely, and his face was sickly red. However, the blade in his hand did not lift even half an inch, and fell on the raised pole again and again. Su Buling was smashed to the ground, lying there without even a chance to get up. The moment the blade struck, his shoulder hit the frozen mud. Each cut was deeper and deeper, until his whole body was sunk into the mud, but his arms were like the Optimus Jade Pillar, it remains motionless. Ah! Sidu Yuejin was almost crazy and sealed the demon. The last knife changed his body that was spinning like the wind. He held the knife in both hands and went around his back. His feet were rooted in the earth and he slashed down with the force of splitting Huashan Mountain. This sword is Sidu Yuejin's strongest sword. He condensed his lifelong skills and squeezed out all the power he could squeeze from his body. He increased the strength of the sword to 100% and gave up all subsequent moves such as changing moves and moving around. With this sword strike, it would be difficult to continue. Even if he moves, his physical strength can only support swinging the heavy sword until this point. Master! Nightingale was horrified when she saw this, but she was so far away and had no chance of helping. Zhongli and Chuchu were stunned, with their mouths open and had no idea what they were doing. The blade fell, splitting Huashan with force. Su Buling roared angrily, lay down in the pit, and held up the heavy sword with a pole. After the muffled sound, the arms that were stretched upright were finally shaken, and the blade sank into the pole, almost breaking the long pole, and continued to fall on Su Buling's head while pressing the long pole. It's just that Su Buling has practiced this kind of head-on fighting style since he was a child, and he has never met an opponent who can use brute force to break his body. The blade bent his arms, his elbows hit the ground, and he continued to support the heavy knife. And the unstoppable blade finally reached the end of its power, and when it hit the tip of Su Buletinling's nose, it was held up by the pole and it was difficult to make any further progress. Ah! Veins popped up on Sidu Yuejin's forehead, and the towering muscles of his arms on his back tore his robe. He held the knife in both hands and pressed down with all his strength, but without the inertial momentum just accumulated, it was difficult to exert much force. Su Buling's eyes were ferocious. After taking the 28 swords, there was no follow-up, so he naturally found an opportunity to counterattack. He suddenly straightened his arms, raised his strength from the ground, and pushed away the thick blade on the pole with all his strength. Sidu Yuejin was at the end of his strength and staggered back due to this push. There was surprise in his eyes, as if he didn't expect that a capable person could take all 28 of his swords and still have energy left. However, this battle is not over yet, and there is no room for shock and size. The moment Su Buling pushed Sidu Yuejin away, he bounced off the ground, threw the long spear halfway, and the drunken bamboo sword at his waist was unsheathed at the same time. The emotion in Sidu Yuejin's eyes dissipated in an instant, and he raised his knife to split the long spear that shot out. But the next moment, a slender blade had already struck in front of him. The body spins like the wind, and the knife is like a round fan blade. The starting position of the 28-way chain knife. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 556. Su Buling is less than 20 years old and ranks among the top martial arts masters. He has been familiar with martial arts since he was a child. If he can't learn to slash 28 times, he won't need to practice martial arts in the future. Although this sword was used for the first time, its movement and momentum were far deeper than that of Sidu Huiyu, who had been practicing for more than 10 years, and it was only slightly more immature than Sidu Yuejin. Sidu Yuejin's eyes showed a bit of astonishment. He thought that Su Buling had secretly learned Sidu's sword skills before. The blade was in front. At this time, he didn't have time to think about it. He hurriedly raised the 9-ring sword to block it in front of him, holding it with his left hand. Hold the back of the knife. Clang. Su Buling was holding a straight knife, which was much lighter than the 9-ring knife. The force was definitely not as strong as the heavy knife, but it also depends on the strength of the person using the knife. The white clothes swept through the wind and snow, and the blade almost hit the thick 9-ring knife with a terrifying force. At the same time as sparks flew everywhere, Sidu Yuejin's arms shook violently, bending slightly, and his whole body sank a little. Before he could backhand, the second knife fell again. Dang 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 dash. Sidu Yuejin had just fired 28 swords in a row and was almost exhausted. Although it was not easy for Su Buling to take the 28 swords, the sword was young and energetic, and after all, the latter had greater potential. Su Buling got angry after being suppressed and slashed 28 times, and in his rage he spared no force with his swords. Eunuch Jia once said, 100 sharp blows are not as good as one accurate one. Su Buling deeply remembered this and never swung the sword randomly like a reckless man. Each sword hit the 9-ring sword accurately. On the gap of the blade, the gap visibly deepens to the naked eye, until more than an inch is penetrated into the blade, and it continues to chop downwards. 28-way serial knives are known for their simplicity and dominance. Simple things often mean high fault tolerance, just like Liu He Gun's Zhongping gun and Zhu Liu's Shaking Mountain. You can either force it or hide it. It's simple, giving the opponent no chance to counterattack. As the founder, Sidu Yuejin understands the strengths and weaknesses of the 28-way serial knife better than anyone in the world. The advantage is that it is ingenious but not powerful and unstoppable. The disadvantage is that it consumes too much and can only cut 28 cuts. Within 28 swords, if the opponent is slightly negligent, he will be killed or disabled. If he tries to escape, he will be hit by at least one sword, and it is impossible to escape intact. It was precisely because of this clear understanding that Sidu Yuejin was retreating steadily and had no backhand, so he could only resist with the help of the 9-ring knife in his hand. It's just that Su Buling can catch Sidu Yuejin's 28 blows. Sidu Yuejin, who has already fought one round, obviously can't catch Su Buling's return. After only 9 blows, Sidu Yuejin's jaws burst open, and blood oozed from the corners of his mouth with a groan. After the 10th blow, his knees could no longer support him and he knelt directly on the ground. Once there is no way to retreat to relieve the force, all the force on the blade will be exerted on the body. With the 11th blow, Sidu Yuejin's knees sank more than 2 inches into the mud. The 12th stabbing caused blood to spurt out of his mouth, which obviously shocked his lungs. Drink. Su Buling followed him like a shadow. The moment he gained the upper hand, he immediately turned to holding the knife with both hands and slashed down with the force of cleaving Huashan Mountain. A cold light flashed in the windy and snowy night, and then sparks burst out. The unparalleled sharp drunken bamboo fell on the thick 9-ring knife. The big knife that had been cut with a big gap was broken immediately and continued to fall. Sidu Yuejin knelt on the ground, his hands bleeding profusely, the sword in his hand was broken, and there was no way to block it. There was a bit of shock in his eyes, and he looked straight at the blade hitting his forehead. A charlatan will die sooner or later. The sword can come suddenly, but it cannot be too cowardly. For Sidu Yuejin, the sword was indeed caught off guard and he did not expect it at all. However, after the bloody battle, he died majestically under the sword technique he created without being a coward at all. This was the ending he deserved after a lifetime of being a swordsman. Because of this, before his death, Sidu Yuejin had no panic or fear. However, the unstoppable blade did not fall on Sidu Yuejin's head, but stopped abruptly in front of his forehead. After Su Buletinling cut off the 9-ring knife, he withdrew his strength, held the knife with both hands, and forced it to stop in front of Sidu Yuejin's head. The sharp blade did not move at all, and his chest heaved and panted like an ox. Hoo-hoo! The cold and snowy night suddenly became quiet, and the explosive battle turned to stagnation in just a moment. If it weren't for the still wind and snow, Zhongli, Shuchu, and Nightingale would have thought that time had stopped instantly. The two men were breathing loudly, beads of sweat fell on the snow, and bursts of white mist came out of their mouths and noses. Sidu Yuejin knelt on the ground and saw the blade on his forehead stopped. He sat on the snow out of exhaustion and gasped. What's the meaning? A large bead of sweat rolled down Su Buletinling's forehead. He calmed down for a moment before standing up straight. He inserted the long knife back into his waist with his backhand and slowly sheathed it. Good sword skills will belong to me from now on. I'll spare you this time. Your Sidu family owes me a life, how about that? After the battle, Sidu Yuejin had no strength left. He looked at the broken knife in his hand and threw it on the ground. It's up to you. If you don't kill me, I can't commit suicide. A serious charlatan, he speaks so simply. Su Buling didn't need Sidu Yuejin to make any promises. If he wanted to be shameless, he would keep it. If he was shameless, he wouldn't need such a bastard. Then he turned around, picked up the long tree from the snow, and walked towards Zui Fengma. Sidu Yuejin sat on the snow without getting up. He looked at Su Buring's back and thought for a while. This sword complements you. After you master it, you will probably be invincible. The only people in the world who can defeat the sword are Li Hanzheng, Zhou Qingkaiu, and Eunuch Xie. The rest are all ants. Su Buring didn't respond, but raised his hand casually, then turned over and jumped onto the wind-chasing horse, heading towards the east. The wind and snow are still there. People are old and their swords are broken. As a swordsman, there is nothing more miserable than this. However, Sidu Yuejin sat on the snow for a while, not showing any helplessness, but looking slightly satisfied. This is the case with martial arts inheritance. It is passed on to the descendants of disciples, and it is also passed on to enemies. As long as you can kill someone with good kung fu, your opponent will have to use it even if they pinch their noses. If you use it, you can't get rid of the name of the founder, even if it's a life or death feud. Sidu Yuejin is the founder of the 28-way chain knife. I can see that the top heroes who will dominate the world in the next 30 years will use his sword skills. This is not the shame of the loser, but the incompetence in martial arts moves. Glory to the right hand of man. After practicing martial arts to this point, there is nothing to hurt the spring and the autumn. Tap tap tap. After Su Buling defeated Sidu Yuejin, he galloped on his horse and quickly left the snowy battlefield. After turning around the woods and out of Sidu Yuejin's sight, he coughed a few times and raised his hands to open his sleeves. Connecting Sidu Yuejin's 28 swords with all his strength, he was the only one in the world, so it was naturally impossible for him to do it lightly. At this time, both arms were still swollen and tingling, with a blackish-green color. It was obvious that they had been strained due to excessive exertion. The shoulders, waist and legs that bear the force are also sore and unbearable. If I don't cultivate for a few days, I'm afraid the root cause of the disease will fall. Su Buling frowned, took out gauze and gold sore medicine from the horse's side bag, and bandaged the cracked tiger's mouth, while looking for traces of the nightingale in the forest. But Su Buling had just turned around the forest, and before he could suppress his heavy breathing, he spotted a black figure holding a long sword in front of the road out of the corner of his eye. He appeared silently and didn't know when, and it seemed that he just appeared in the blink of an eye. Emerged from the ground. Su Buling's face changed slightly, and he was really shocked. This kind of movement technique that comes and goes without a shadow is not a master but also a half-step master. He had just fought with Sidu Yuejin with all his strength and consumed a lot. He didn't even take a sip of water. If he met Songying and Songying in their heyday at this time, Chendeazai, the real god has to explain it here. Su Buling quickly grasped the handle of the knife at his waist, turned his gaze to the black shadow, and at the same time raised his hand to stop Nightingale, who was hiding somewhere, from moving. The figures in front of the road were about 50 steps apart. The wind and snow were too heavy and the sky was dark, so the figures could not be seen clearly. However, the immovable aura of the mountain made it clear that he was an extraordinary person. Su Buling held the handle of the knife, his face darkened, and he said loudly, "Who is coming?" The figure in front did not respond. He stood for a moment and then walked over slowly. Su Buling jumped off the horse. The drunken bamboo sword with the handle still hot was unsheathed again, pointing diagonally at the ground. His eyes were unruly and unfazed. Tap tap tap. The pace seemed slow and then quick, and he soon came close. Under the dim light, he could vaguely see the appearance of the person wearing a light green robe, with a simple sword hanging on his waist, and white jade beads hanging on the sword tassel. He is in his 40s, with sword-shaped eyebrows and an aquiline nose. He looks very handsome. If you look closely, you can see that his nose and face shape are somewhat similar to Su Buling's. Su Buling was stunned for a moment, frowned and looked at it while holding the single sword, and said slightly uncertainly, "Uncle." In the peach grove on the hillside, Zhongli Chuchu had just woken up from the shock. Before he could cheer for his master's invincible husband, he saw a figure suddenly appearing on the road, and his heart suddenly became cold again. Nightingale was also slightly startled, holding the hilt of the sword and wanting to go down to help, but when she heard Su Buling's uncle, her big and energetic eyes were filled with joy again. Zhongli Chuchu noticed the change in Nightingale's expression and knew that the person coming was a helper, so she quickly asked, "Who is this?" "Someone sent by Prince Su." Nightingale had already relaxed, with a bit of surprise in her eyes, and said seriously, "Young master's biological uncle, Princess Su's brother, and the head of the Lu family in the East China Sea, have you ever heard that his sword does not move, but his mind sings 100 times?" Zhongli Chuchu's eyes lit up. She naturally knew who this adjective known to everyone in the world was referring to, the former sword master Lu Beiming. The old sword master Zhu Zhoushan took over the title of sword master after his death. Until Zhu Lu appeared, he was the first swordsman in the world. However, when Tai Ying was hunting deer, the Lu family of Donghai suffered a great disaster. The old patriarch died in battle outside the house. In order to protect the whole family from drawing swords, Lu Beiming expressed his attitude to the court. From then on, Lu Beiming was in Bai Chi Yamayan Bai thought about it, and the only time he took action was during the sword master battle with Zhu Lu. The Lu family of Donghai was in Qingzhou, very close to each other, but Lu Beiming kept thinking about his mistakes. Even Su Buling didn't expect that this uncle would come out of the mountain, let alone Nightingale and Zhongli Chuchu. On the road, Su Buling put away the long knife with a surprised look in his eyes. He walked closer and carefully identified it. After confirming that it was Lu Beiming who had visited him in Suzhou when he was a child, he smiled a little. "Uncle, why are you here?" Lu Beiming was dressed quite elegantly. He walked up to him with his sword in hand. He looked up and down, with some approval in his eyes. "We haven't seen each other for many years. She is now this old. She looks exactly like your mother. If she knows that you knock Situ Yuejin down, she will definitely be happy." They had a quarrel in the world back then. Su Buling had a deep affection for Princess Su when he was a child. When he first came here, every time he recalled her from his memory, his heart felt like a knife, and it was the same now. He walked closer and wiped the sweat from his forehead a little. "Yes, father has always wanted to have a drink with you." I haven't seen you go to Suzhou for so many years. Lu Beiming raised his hand, not wanting to mention the helpless and sad things of the past. He just said calmly. Your cousin Hung Xiu told me about Bodhi Island. He was afraid that something might happen to you, so he asked me to come over and help you escape. I didn't want to show up at first, but Chen Daizai and Zhang Buhan had already arrived in Yuzhou and were searching nearby. It will arrive soon, you will definitely not be able to defeat it. When Su Buling heard this, he frowned, showing a bit of irritation. This stinky cow nose is really haunting. Didn't he die on Bodhi Island? According to what Hung Xiu said, Chen Daizai was frightened by Li Hanzhen's attack and was injured and escaped. When you come here this time, I'm afraid the King of Chu arranged to take your life so that you can blame the court and let King Su send troops to attack Chang'an. Su Buling thought about it for a moment and understood the intention. In order to become the emperor, he would not hesitate to cause trouble in Chang'an. He is quite cruel. By the way, why did Hung Xiu get involved with Dainglu? Is it the uncle's instruction or? Lu Beiming shook his head. The rules of the world are not passed down between two people. First kill Chen Daizai and Zhang Buhan, and I will send you out of Yuzhou. You can figure out the rest by yourself. Su Buling looked a little helpless and wanted to say, you are my uncle, but Jianghu is not a temple, and people in Jianghu who follow rules are like this. Forcing the question will only make the other party embarrassed, so he did not say more. After taking a short rest, he called Nightingale, and together with Lu Beiming, entered the peach blossom forest all over the mountains and plains. Thank you for the great reward, boss. It's the end of the month, please vote. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 557. The Prince is Fierce. Hidden Dragon Scale Shadow. Chapter 74. Hunting Butterflies in Flowers. Chen Daizai and Zhang Buhan followed the sound to the east, but were blocked by mountains outside the Peach Blossom Sea. In order to avoid losing the target, they did not take a detour. After hiding their horses by the road, they entered the forest and searched on the snowy ridge with their extraordinary lightness skills. When the two were halfway there, they suddenly heard a man's loud shout from behind the dense forest a mile away. Run, they are chasing us. There was nothing else in the wild except the wind and snow, and the voice came with the wind, and it was very clear. Chen Daizai recognized Su Buling's voice, and suddenly paused, raising his hand. It's Su Buling, be careful. Zhang Buhan naturally heard it too, and pulled up the black scarf around his neck to cover his face to avoid being seen by the wolf guards chasing behind. He took off the long sword behind him and held it in his hand, leaped onto the treetops, and moved silently in the dense forest, not even shaking off the snow accumulated on the branches, which shows how high his Qinggong is. Chen Daizai was not afraid of Su Buling seeing his identity, but if he was recognized by the wolf guards, he would be suspected by the court. He also covered his face and moved from the ground to the other end of the dense forest, forming a left and right encirclement. Rustle. The subtle sound was like a venomous snake crawling over the grass leaves, mixed with the sound of the wind and barely audible. The two sneaked through the mountains and forests, and gradually could distinguish the violent panting and staggering footsteps from the sound of the wind. Zhang Buhan stopped and raised his hands slightly. Chen Daizai identified the target by listening to the sound and knew that the target was more than 100 steps to the left front. He slowed down suddenly, stepped on the snow with his toes, moved to the dark part of the woods without making any sound, and took a cautious look. In the woods not far away, Su Buling was holding a single sword and hanging an iron bow and arrow pot on his body. He staggered forward in the snow. He was obviously seriously injured. He took 2 steps and coughed a few times until he had difficulty walking. He leaned against a peach tree and gasped for breath. He also looked back a few times, as if he was looking for pursuers. Seeing this scene, the two people hiding in the dark were all brightened. They were originally worried about Su Buling's inhuman combat power. A dying tiger is often the most ferocious, and even if the two join forces, it may cause serious damage. Now Su Buling is seriously injured and obviously at the end of his strength. It is also a great advantage that the enemy is in the open and we are in the dark. It is almost like sending a head to the face. What is there to hesitate? Zhang Buhan glanced around. There was no movement nearby. There were only sporadic footsteps in the distance, but it was half a mile away, so it would take time to run over. Life and death fights are a matter of a moment. The two of them joined forces to assassinate, and this time was enough to kill Su Buling 10 times. Ka. In the peach forest on a snowy night, the sound of boots stomping on the ground and tree trunks rang out at the same time. The two martial arts masters burst out from the dark, and their movements were so fast that they were like two leopards jumping out of the forest. In an instant, they were about 10 steps away from Su Buling. Grandmaster level masters bully the weak with their strength. Basically, they will kill in 10 steps. Ordinary people don't even have a chance to fight back, not to mention that Su Buling can't even stand steadily now. Chen Daozai's eyes suddenly condensed, and the long sword in his hand stabbed Su Buling's chest and abdomen like a white snake spitting out its tongue. Although he was injured, he was still a little faster than Zhang Buhan after a short burst of full force. Zhang Buhan came from the sky and slashed Su Buling's left neck with a sword, using his strongest killing moves. In this case, even if Su Buling had great skills, he couldn't block it all. What surprised the two was that Su Buling would definitely notice their appearance with his martial arts, but Su Buling, who was leaning on the tree, did not show any panic, but instead had a strange smile in his eyes. Damn it! The two people's pupils shrank slightly, and they felt a little cold in their hearts. Whoosh! At this moment, the sound of swords suddenly rose in the peach forest, sharp and piercing, coming from all directions, like 100 ghosts howling in the night in the wind and snow forest. Even Su Buling, who was prepared, was startled. Zhang Buhan and Chen Daozai's faces changed suddenly, and they knew who was coming without communication. Among the three great sword families of Zhu, Lu, and Cao, the Lu family sword focuses on the word cunning. Unlike the Zhu and Cao families, which are fierce and swift, the Lu family sword brings the lightness and elegance of the sword to the extreme, and has the reputation of the sword pierces the heavy rain without getting wet, and the butterfly hunts in the flowers without hurting the flowers. The current head of the family, Lu Beiming, has taken a different approach from the Lu family sword and brought the cunning way of sword to the extreme. Before he was 20 years old, his reputation of the sword arrives before it makes a sound, and the sword does not move but the intention is Beiming spread far and wide. This is also the reason why Lu Beiming was able to take over the title of Sword Saint after the death of the old Sword Saint. If it weren't for the Iron Eagle hunting deer that year, which made Lu Beiming cut off his sword path and face the wall for 10 years, his current achievements would probably be no less than any of the former Sword Saints. The Lu family swords are all about the cunning way, and Lu Beiming is the best in this way. Even if Zhang Buhan and Chen Daozai fight head-on, they may not be able to defeat the former Sword Saint Lu Beiming. It is self-evident how dangerous the situation is when they are attacked by Lu Beiming without any preparation. 80. The moment Zhang Buhan and Chen Daozai realized that something was wrong, they wanted to put their swords back to defend. But when they heard the sound of the sword, they must have drawn the sword. It was too late to rush back to defend at this time. In the snowy ridges covered with peach trees, the cold light rose with the sound of the sword, and it was like a whirlwind, flashing from the left to the right, passing through the two people. Ding ding. The two sounds of the collision of weapons and the flying sparks seemed to be heard only after the whirlwind stopped. Chen Daozai and Zhang Buhan were caught off guard. Although the swords in their hands blocked the sharp blades pulled from below, the action was too hasty, and a thin line was pulled on their chests, deep enough to see the bones, and the blood had not yet had time to seep out. The flying figure had no foothold and was also shaken upward into the air by the force of the sword. The most taboo among warriors is to fly in the air, because they have nowhere to use their strength to move. Just now, the two of them joined forces to launch an assassination. They naturally chose the fastest way and did not pay attention to this. But now it became a fatal flaw. In a life and death fight between masters, who would do it? What chance do you have of landing and stabilizing your body? Su Buling didn't stand there in a daze. When he saw the two of them being knocked away, he stepped on the ground with his sword without hesitation. He moved forward with the strong wind. He flashed to the side of Chendeazai as fast as thunder and waved the sword in his hand like the wind. The knife was pointed at Chendeazai's life gate. Chendeazai's life was hanging by a thread. Even though he was unable to move and dodge in the air, he did not move slowly with his hands and tried to block with his sword. After Lu Beiming's sword strike, he naturally did not stand still watching the show. After rushing to the right, he stepped on the tree trunk with one foot. His body was as light as a butterfly, but in the blink of an eye he was in front of the two of them. Lu Jian's 36 swords came out in unison, like a burst. The rain of swords fell towards Zhang Buhan. Ding ding ding. Sparks were flying in the air, and although it was only the moment when they soared into free fall, the four of them exchanged several attacks and defenses. Zhang Buhan and Chendeazai were plotted against each other, and they were at a disadvantage from the beginning. They had the right time, place, and people, and it would be damned if they could take advantage. But in the blink of an eye, 3 stab wounds appeared on Chendeazai's body, one after another, and even half of his left ear was cut off. Facing Lu Beiming's explosive attack, Zhang Buhan was unable to move in the air and was unable to parry. He only returned 2 swords, leaving him with a tight defense. Smelly cow nose. Do you think you are the only one who has help? Su Buling didn't have the slightest fondness for Chendeazai. Although the beating of Sidu Yuejin just now was very exhausting, Chendeazai's current situation was much worse than him. If he couldn't use up the strength to beat the drowned dog, then the 110 kilograms of meat would be in vain. Longer. He exploded with all his strength in a short period of time, and fell with 7 or 8 knives, smashing Chendeazai to the ground. The moment Chendeazai landed, he found a place to support himself. Without any hesitation, he kicked the ground with his feet and slid his body out of the snow. Su Buling held the straight knife upside down and thrust it vertically, only wiping a bloody gash on Chendeazai's leg. Without giving Chendeazai a chance to breathe, he drew the knife and struck Chendeazai again, who was sliding on the ground. When you reach the realm of Grandmaster, you can clearly understand the battle situation without analyzing it. Chendeazai's plan to lure the enemy was in a desperate situation. It was impossible for him to risk his life in a life-or-death fight. He raised his hand and threw a sword at Lu Beiming, who was fighting Zhang Buhan. The sword pointed straight at his back and fired a sharp wind-breaking sword. Ming. Attacked from the front and back, Lu Beiming drew back his sword and defended behind him, which would inevitably reveal a flaw in front of him. When Su Buling saw this, he suddenly flew forward and knocked away the long sword on the side with one strike. He rolled around and got up. When he looked up, he saw that Chendeazai had already rushed into the forest and was more than 30 steps away. Lu Beiming made the first attack and wounded Zhang Buhan. At this time, he had the upper hand. While pressing forward step by step with his long sword, he said in a deep voice, "I can't show my face and eradicate the roots." As soon as Chendeazai runs away, the news that Lu Beiming came out of Baichi Cliff will inevitably spread. The Lu family of Donghai surrendered when Tai Ying hunted deer, and now he is absolutely submissive in the eyes of the court. He doesn't even dare to leave the Lu family's gate, and has even drawn a clear line with King Su. As the head of the Lu family, even if Lu Beiming was Su Buling's uncle, if he came out to help Su Buling at this time, it would be a disaster if the court knew about it. The imperial court may not be able to move Ziliang, but if it wants to mobilize the border troops to destroy a wealthy family, it's just a matter of raising their hands. There is no excuse. Su Buling knew the seriousness of the matter, which was why he was dissatisfied with his cousin Lu Hongxiu's behavior in entering the Eagle Tower. Seeing Chen Daozai trying to escape, he immediately chased after him with a knife. Zhang Buhan's chest was already stained with blood. When he heard these words, he knew that there was no chance of escape today. One of him and Lu Beiming would definitely die. Under the desperate situation, Zhang Buhan also showed the bravery and ruthlessness that a military leader should have. However, in a master-level fight, one wrong move will always result in the whole game being lost. No matter how small a flaw is, it will expand infinitely, and he has already lost the first move. Injured, no matter how brave he is just struggling to his death. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gongzi. Chapter 558. The Crown Prince is very fierce. Chapter 75 of the Hidden Dragon Scale Shadow. Chapter 75, The Drowned Dog in the Sea of Peach Blossoms. It is windy and snowy, and I don't know what day it is. Su Buletinling ran wildly through the forest with a single sword in hand, locking the figures in front of him, more than 50 steps away from each other. An injured person may be affected in a fight, but when it comes to escaping, he will definitely be faster than in his heyday. With his life hanging by a thread, even ordinary people can unleash unimaginable potential, let alone Chen Daozai, who is a military commander. The mountains are rugged and roadless, but Chen Daozai is walking on flat ground. It is no exaggeration to describe him as fast as thunder. In order to escape for his life, Chen Daozai could increase his speed crazily regardless of the cost. Su Buling didn't have to worry about his life, but it was difficult for him to run to death when being chased. Even if he wanted to, without the sense of crisis around the neck of the knife holder, it would be difficult to stimulate the potential of overdrafting the body. This is not what he can do. Controlled. They chased them for more than 4 miles between the mountains. Instead of closing the distance, they became further and further apart. Su Buling gritted his teeth and ran with all his strength, trying to draw his bow and arrow, but the mountains were uneven and there were too many trees, making it impossible to shoot through. The two of them gradually stepped into the depths of the Peach Blossom Sea in Penghu. The surrounding area was deserted and there was no clearing in the mountains where they could stop. Dense shrubs and dead vines were intertwined. Even Wu Kuei found it difficult to run quickly in this situation. Chen Daozai used his sleeves to sweep away the dead vine branches blocking his way. The multiple wounds on his chest were bleeding profusely. His face became paler and whiter, and was stained red with blood from his ears. It was obvious that he was under great pressure. But Su Buletinling didn't need to open the way, he just had to follow and quickly closed the distance. Chen Daozai's eyes showed a bit of anxiety. Fortunately, after climbing over a mountain, a rushing river appeared in front of him. Chen Daozai jumped into the river without hesitation, stepping on the water and speeding downstream, his speed reaching the extreme again. Only this time, it wasn't two legs chasing him. Although the river is winding and fast, it is still straight for short distances, and it is empty and free of debris. There are only 2 people walking on the river. Chen Daozai couldn't fly more than a few dozen steps, and Su Buling behind him also fell into the water. Then there was a sharp sound of wind, and an arrow pointed directly at his vest. Walking on water consumes a lot of energy, and treading on water is different from treading on land. You cannot use the force to make sharp turns, and the turning radius is very large. Su Buletinling opened the bow and fired arrows while running. Although it would affect the running speed, there was not much difference between aiming and shooting on horseback. The arrows fired from the 3-stone bow were obviously much faster than those shot with 2 legs. An arrow struck from behind, and Chen Daozai cursed angrily, "Despicable," then he dove into the water and swam forward. The river in the mountains is not a lake. The deepest part is only waist high. It is full of dark pools and rocks. It is not easy to swim. The only advantage is that the river is fast and you can use the current to travel along the current. Su Buling was flying across the water with an iron bow. After hearing the despicable sound, he laughed angrily and didn't bother to argue. He said, "What can you do to me?" and then he drew his bow and arrow again, shooting at Chendeazai, who was splashing in the water. Rustle rustle. Arrows are like falling stars. Chendeazai was able to use his strength in the water and was able to hear the sound and identify his position to avoid it. However, the resistance to moving in the water was too great and the energy consumption doubled. After a moment, his face turned purple from suffocation. If his life was not hanging by a thread, he would have fallen down long ago. The deep water area eventually ends. When I run deep into the river, the water becomes shallow and only knee-deep, making it impossible to swim. Chendeazai got up and waded into the water and ran wildly, moving left and right to avoid arrows. Su Buling did not hold on, and landed on the shallow beach. He shot Chendeazai in the back with an arrow while running quickly. After using up most of the arrows in the pot, he pulled out the feather arrow stuck in the river and continued shooting. With such endless interference and pursuit, even if Chendeazai is a martial arts master, exhausted and suffering from internal and external injuries, it is impossible for him to be completely negligent. When passing a stone on the river beach, I accidentally stepped on it while trying to avoid it, causing me to stumble a little. Cha! It was at this moment that an arrow shot from the three-stone bow penetrated into his back and pierced through his left shoulder. One wrong step, every wrong step. Bookbar. The inertia of the sharp arrows made Chendeazai stumble forward, and two more arrows struck, burying themselves in his back. Puff. Chendeazai walked a long distance, his energy and blood surged, and his lungs were about to explode. After being seriously injured, he immediately spat out a mouthful of blood and fell into the water. Su Buling was also panting like an ox, his heart was beating like a drum, his fingers that were used to draw the bow were bloodshot, and his arms were directly strained and the pain was unbearable. But at this moment, these obviously had no impact. He just slowed down his pace, opened his bow and shot at Chendeazai's back, hitting his vital points without sparing any effort. "You run away from me. Suff. Ahem." The violent wheezing and coughing almost drowned out the sound of the river. The reason why martial arts masters are afraid of the imperial court's feathered arrows is because no matter how tight the defense is, there will always be times when they are thick and thin. A shot to the torso will cause a penetrating injury, and a shot to the hands and feet will inevitably hinder movement. Basically, if you hit the first arrow, you will end up being turned into a hedgehog by thousands of arrows. After Chendeazai was hit by several arrows in a row, he threw himself in the water and crawled forward on his hands and feet. His speed was still very fast, but it was no longer easy to avoid the arrows. In an instant, his back was filled with arrows, until Su Buling took the arrows. "Shoot empty." Boom boom boom. A huge roar was heard, and the two chased each other to the waterfall at the end of the river. Chendeazai's eyes were bloodshot, and his mouth and nose were covered in blood, but Wu Kui's willpower was still there and he climbed towards the waterfall with all his strength, trying to escape by rushing into the waterfall. Su Buling was almost exhausted after chasing for so far. Even though he knew that Chendeazai would not survive, he would not let him go until he saw him close his eyes. He took a deep breath and rose from the river. He drew out the long sword from his waist and stabbed Chendeazai in the back like a black eagle pouncing on a rabbit. Chendeazai's eyes showed some fear. He suddenly raised his hand and swept back, saying hoarsely, "Stop." The straight sword was inserted into the back of his neck, pierced through his throat, and stuck into the stone at the edge of the waterfall, more than an inch into the stone. The hand rose and the sword fell, and the noise suddenly quieted down. Chendeazai was nailed into the river immediately, and his raised hand fell down, and there was no movement at all. Who? Su Buling held the handle of the sword with both hands, and his muscles were twitching all over his body. His heartbeats were continuous, and the violent beating in his chest could be seen with the naked eye. The mountains were desolate and the river water was icy cold. After the intense exercise, he suddenly stopped. His forehead was hurt by the boiling blood and he felt a little dizzy. Su Buling held the handle of the knife and panted for a long time. He scooped up the river water and drank 2 mouthfuls. He wiped his face and recovered a little. He looked down at Chen Daozai's body, touched his neck with his hand, and after confirming that he was dead, he breathed a sigh of relief. The dust settled. Su Buling stood up on his knees, drew out his long knife, looked up and looked around, distinguishing east, west, south and north. But at a glance, he saw a dark shadow on the top of the forest next to the waterfall. When he looked over, it flapped its wings and flew away, making an eagle cry. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gongzi. Chapter 559. The Crown Prince is very fierce. Chapter 76 of Hidden Dragon Scale Shadow. Chapter 76. The storm has stopped for the time being. One wave has not subsided, but another wave has arisen. Su Buling's face changed slightly when he heard the eagle cry, and he recognized that it was the wolf guard's eagle. He was chasing the falcon in the mountains, and he must have been spotted by the falcon circling high in the sky. If it could stop nearby, it meant that the wolf guard had followed. Sure enough, after the eagle crowed, there was a rustling sound of clothes rubbing against cloth in the mountains and fields. They came from both sides and quickly approached this side. During this period, Song Ying's angry shout could be heard. I am Song Ying, the chief of detectives. The Holy One has decreed that Prince Su, hurry up. It was impossible for Su Buling to meet Song Ying face to face. After all, King Su had not rebelled yet and was a minister of the emperor. If he ran away even though the imperial edict was read in front of his face, there would be no explanation afterwards and the drama had to be staged. He looked back at the waterfall. After confirming the depth, he continued to pretend not to hear Song Ying's call and shouted angrily. There's still an ambush. I'll report it to the Holy One after I get out. You traitors are doomed. As soon as he finished speaking, he jumped deep into the raging waterfall. The faces of the wolf guards who followed the falcon changed. Dozens of them rushed out of the forest and jumped into the river. They quickly ran to the edge of the waterfall to check. Song Ying arrived as quickly as possible, and cautiously approached the edge of the waterfall with her Yanling knife. She looked over and saw that Su Buling had long since lost sight of him. There was no light outside the waterfall, and he couldn't even see the distance or depth clearly. The leader of the wolf guard of Tianzi camp next to him stood in front of him and hesitated slightly. Should we pursue or not? Let's not talk about whether we can catch him or not. Prince Su was fighting with others just now, which consumed a lot of money. If he fell to death, I'm afraid it would be difficult to explain. Song Ying hesitated slightly and looked down at the corpse in the river. She squatted down in the water, turned over the corpse with arrows on its back, and pulled away the black scarf that covered her face. Suddenly, there was a gasping sound. Hiss. What the hell, Chen Daozai? Wudain killing god, how could he die here? Seeing the face of the corpse, the faces of the surrounding wolf guards changed slightly, with shock and disbelief in their eyes. When they first came over, they met Sidu Yuejin sitting on the ground, holding a broken knife and doubting life. Knowing that Sidu Yuejin was beaten to the ground was already shocking beyond measure. I followed the falcon to find this place, and saw Su Buling chasing him. I thought I was chasing some fish in the world, but I didn't expect that Chen Daozai was beaten to death here. There are only 8 military leaders in the world, 2 of them died and 2 were defeated in the hands of Su Buling. He also defeated Eunuch Jia and frightened Song Ying. In an upright duel, One person can defeat half of the masters in the world, how can this be said? Naturally, Song Ying didn't understand how Chendeizai could appear in the barren mountains, but when she saw this powerful man being beaten to death here, she was obviously frightened. First he defeated Sidu Yuejin, and then killed Chendeizai. Who knows if Su Buling had any remaining strength, so he killed him too. Song Ying looked at Chendeizai's body, then looked at the bottomless waterfall, and was silent for a moment. Well, don't chase the poor bandits. Let the falcons search first and surround the Pinggu area. When Lao Yi and the others arrive, they will come over to arrest them. The wolf guards are all on official business, and they naturally cherish their lives by eating royal food and serving the public. At this time, no one objected, so they lifted Chendeizai's body and left the waterfall. In the deep pool below the waterfall, Su Buling held his knife and looked forward to it. After waiting for a long time, Song Ying didn't come down, and he was still a little confused for a while. After waiting for a while, Su Buling finally breathed a sigh of relief after confirming that no one had jumped down to his death. After fighting for half a night and traveling long distances, the stupid wife who had eaten the marrow and knew the taste beforehand was squeezed without mercy, and the iron body was hollowed out. After relaxing, Su Buletinling found it difficult to regain his strength and fell into the water. He lay on the water to rest and floated downstream. The wind and snow were still there, and time passed not long ago. The ground under the peach blossom tree where the four of them were fighting just now was in a mess. Trees, grass, and vines within a few feet of the area were all flattened, and the ground was stained with blood. The former sword master Lu Beiming was standing in front of a big tree as thick as an arm. His robes were slightly damaged and there was a bloody gash on his right arm. On the big tree, Zhang Buhan was covered in blood, with more than 100 dense wounds. Although the wounds were not deep, there was no good spot on his body, and the blood had flowed cleanly. Dong Hailu's family famous sword Long Yuan was inserted into Zhang Buhan's heart and nailed to the tree trunk at the back until the hilt penetrated from the back of the tree trunk. The blade was not stained with blood and was still as bright as new. Tap tap tap. Footsteps sounded from the woods. Zhongli, Shuchu, and Nightingale, who were already dumbfounded, ran over carefully arm in arm. Only after they were sure that the enemy was dead did they dare to come forward. 56. Nightingale's eyes were quite respectful. She looked her over for a moment and said, "Mr. Lu, you are so powerful. In my opinion, you are no worse than the sword master Zhu Lu. How could you lose to him in the sword debate at Bai Chi Cliff?" Lu Beiming smiled softly, raised his hand to pull out the sword from the corpse, and put back the scabbard on his waist. "Zhu Liuzeo's swordsmanship is different from mine. He only uses one sword to kill people, and only one sword. I have to slowly Ling Chi. I may not be able to kill him with dozens of swords. I will be dead with one sword, so there is nothing I can do." Beat. Nightingale has been smart since she was a child and has a deep knowledge of martial arts. When she heard this, she immediately understood that one had strong explosive power and the other had strong endurance, but it only took one attack to kill, so Lu Beiming couldn't beat him. Zhongli Chuchu's eyes were still a little frightened. Witnessing this top-notch fight in the world, her heart was so tense that she even forgot about her master sleeping with a man behind her back. Her martial arts skills were not very high, and she could not discuss these profound martial arts knowledge. Seeing that Su Buling did not come back, she asked nervously, "Will Mr. Su be okay?" Lu Beiming's eyes were calm. "Chendeizai has hidden injuries on his body, and he was hit by my sword again. If he can't beat him again, there will be no one to blame." The Jianghe Grand Master always has this tone of being downbeat about life and death, but it can still be quite comforting. Zhongli Chuchu felt relieved and saw that Lu Beiming was injured, so he took out the gold sore medicine and gauze from his body and helped bandage it. As Zhongli Jiju's apprentice, he naturally knows these things. Lu Beiming only visited Su Buling a few times as his uncle when he was a few years old. After Tai Ying hunted the deer, he never contacted her again, so naturally he never saw these two little girls. However, following Su Buling secretly in recent days, I also found out that Nightingale was Su Buling's maid, and Zhongli Chuchu was Su Buling's concubine, the eighth leader of the contemporary generation. Little girl, take care of the body and surrounding traces to prevent the wolf guards from discovering it. Nightingale nodded seriously, ran around to pick up dead branches and scraps of wood, piled them together, then dragged the body over, processed the surrounding traces, and prepared to burn it. Lu Beiming stood there, raised his hand and asked Zhongli Chuchu to bandage his forearm. After thinking for a while, he said again. Miss Zhongli, I was in the town just now and I heard that you and your child were quarreling. What happened? Zhongli Chuchu's expression froze, and she recalled what happened in the town. As the saying goes, family scandal should not be made public. Naturally, she couldn't say that her master stole a man because she was angry, so she could only say softly. It's nothing, just, well, some small things. Lu Beiming frowned slightly and thought for a moment. You seem to be saying that your son is a master and a disciple. Could it be that he has also done things to bully a weak woman? The nightingale hugged the dead branch, looking as if I didn't hear it. Zhongli Chuchu's expression was stiff. His uncle was half a father. How could he dare to expose Su Buling in front of his uncle? After a moment of hesitation. Well, it's not that morally corrupt. The reasons are more complicated. I don't know. Lu Beiming knew that a concubine would not dare to say anything bad about a man, so he sighed softly. Your mother hates evil and hates men who are half-hearted and irresponsible. If she were still here, she would definitely be able to take care of your child. That bastard Suyu was a prodigal in Chang'an, and now she has raised her son to be like this. If I had known it, when he came to propose marriage, I could have beaten him to death. How could Zhongli and Chuchu dare to speak? If someone dared to scold her brother-in-law, she would not dare to be disrespectful to King Su. Lu Beiming said some common things and felt that Zhongli Chuchu had a good temperament. Most of the women who were the 8 chiefs had a rough life and ended badly. Su Buling's mother was also the 8 chiefs. As the elder brother, Lu Beiming, how could he not have feelings? Perhaps because he didn't want the sad things of the past to happen again, he spoke again. You don't need to worry in the future. I am Uncle Ling-er. If Suyu can't control it, I can. If Ling-er treats you badly, just tell me directly and I will seek justice for you. Zhongli Chuchu was stunned for a moment, and after thinking for a while, he understood what he meant. Lu Beiming must have misunderstood her as Su Buling's mistress, and was afraid that she would be bullied by Su Buling and had no one to rely on, so he spoke to reassure her. Zhongli Chuchu was slightly panicked. She wanted to explain a few words, but when the words came to her lips, she didn't know why she didn't say them out. She hesitated and smiled a little shyly. Thank you to Mr. Taoying for the 26,000 reward. Thank you to Smoke Style Boss for the 10,000 reward. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 560. The empty valley is quiet and isolated from the world. Following the river in the valley, I don't know how far I have drifted. The rugged mountains on both sides of the river gradually leveled out, replaced by a series of peach trees. In the winter, the branches and leaves fell off, and the snowflakes pressed on the branches, just like the valley is filled with thousands of pear trees. Su Buling lay on the water and closed his eyes tightly, suppressing the overwhelming energy and blood in his chest and abdomen. After his body regained stability, he stopped by the stream, stood up from the water, and looked up around him. Surrounded by mountains, there is no cold winter wind, only snow falling silently. Looking around, it is dark and silent, with no lights in sight and no way out. Judging from the traces along the river, I'm afraid no one has visited this deep mountain and old forest for hundreds of years. Su Buling looked around a few times, but there was no reference and he couldn't tell the difference between north, south, east and west. Now that I was a little calmer, I felt a burning pain on my arm. I lifted up my sleeve and took a look. I saw that the bruise had recovered, but there was still a bit of swelling that probably wouldn't go away in a few days. The body is overloaded with exercise, hungry and cold, and it is obvious that the body feels weak and a little dizzy. After suffering a loss on Bodhi Island last time, Su Buling was not afraid of starving to death in the ice and snow. He took out the emergency rations wrapped in oilcloth from the back of his belt and ate a few mouthfuls with the cold river water, but it was a bit hard to swallow. Call. Su Buletinling sat by the river, replenished some energy, and exhaled softly. The robe on my body was soaked through. If I slept in this ice and snow, I would definitely freeze into a frozen corpse tomorrow morning. I immediately stood up, took off my robe, pulled some dry grass from under the snow, tied it with strips of cloth and put it on my back. His chest barely resisted the cold air. After finishing this, Su Buletinling took a long knife and chopped off the dead branches and rotten trees blocking the road, and walked towards the edge of the valley to see if he could find an exit or find a slightly warmer place to spend the night. There seemed to be no living creatures in the valley, and there were thick leaves and snow on the ground. In order to prevent stepping on objects in holes and animal traps, Su Buling used a knife to poke around while walking. After walking for about half a quarter of an hour, the sound of the river behind them disappeared, and they came to a relatively sparse forest. Woof woof. When Su Buling was carefully groping for the road, there may be too much noise from the long knife chopping down the trees. Suddenly, a dog barked in the distance, which was very obvious in the silent snowy night, and even had some echoes. Su Buling thought it was the wolf guard's hound at first, and immediately lowered his body and listened to the surroundings, but there was no sound of a large group of people walking around. Instead, there was the sound of the wooden door opening and closing. Are there any residents in this damn place? Su Buling was a little confused, but in this world, it is very common for several families to live in the mountains. Most of them were those who fled into the mountains during the Jiazi War. They were isolated from the world and had no contact with worldly affairs. Although it was not as exaggerated as in Peach Blossom Spring, it had not been there for many years. It's normal to walk around outside, which probably means we hear the sounds of chickens and dogs, and we never interact with each other until we die. After hearing the barking of the dog, Su Buling followed the sound and walked there, paying attention to the movement along the way to avoid being ambushed. Not far away, the dense forest opened up a little, and the ground was relatively flat, but it was still full of peach trees. The trees were very small, and some were just saplings. Su Buling took a closer look and saw that the trees were neatly arranged with equal spacing. They were obviously artificially planted. Walking further in, you could see several small vegetable patches. Is there anyone? Su Buling was afraid of scaring the local natives, so he called out. There was no response in the night, but the dog just now rushed over from the darkness very fiercely, and bit Su Buling's arm with an ouch. Seeking death. Su Buletinling raised his hand casually and hit the dog on the head with the back of his knife. The black-haired puppy didn't even hum and just lay down. It was a cold winter night, and Su Buling was shivering from the cold. He lowered his head and took a look at the little black dog. He found that the little black dog was quite clean, so he held the warm dog in his arms to keep warm. He continued to go deeper and walked 50 years. A few steps away, we arrived at a fence. There are 3 small houses inside the fence, which are quite elegantly decorated. There is a deck chair under the melon stand in the courtyard, and several rows of flower pots are placed neatly next to the fence. There is also a relatively large tree next to the house. There are stone mills and other objects. Fellow? Is there anyone? Su Buling just heard the sound of the door opening and closing, and knew that there must be someone nearby. After waiting for a while and seeing no response, he felt really uncomfortable with the cold, so he stepped into the courtyard and listened in front of the main house. When there was no movement, he walked to the window of the side room. Listened. There was a faint sound of breathing in the side room. Judging from the angle, it should be underground. Most of the farmhouses in this world have cellars to store grains and vegetables, and to avoid bandits in times of war. Judging from the situation, he was mistaken for a bandit. When Su Buling saw this, he didn't force his way in. He just said politely outside the window, "Fellow, I'm staying here for one night. I'll leave tomorrow morning. I know how to pay. I'm really bothering you." There was still no response from the room. Seeing this, Su Buling said no more, hugged the warm little black dog and came to the opposite side of the room. Opposite is the kitchen, which has no door. Next to it is a small wooden kennel, which is relatively simple and has some hay inside. Su Buling put down the little black dog and entered the kitchen. When he came to the earthen stove, he touched the firewood placed on the stove and threw the hay and firewood piled next to it into the stove hole. After lighting it, the kitchen suddenly became bright. A bit. The kitchen was not big, but very neatly arranged. Water jars and buckets were placed at the door. Inside was a wooden table with earthenware jars of firewood, rice, oil, and salt on it. A small chopping board was placed vertically against the window, and a few dried fish were hung on the window. There were not many things in the cupboard on the wall, only a wooden plate, a wooden bowl and a pair of chopsticks stacked together. There were a few small wine jars next to it. Everything was neatly arranged, without even a speck of dust. Su Buling walked up to her and took a look. He could tell that she lived alone. Judging from the size of the bowl, she didn't eat much. She was probably a very frugal old lady with misophobia. He picked up the wine jar next to him, opened the cork and smelled it. It should be the wine he brewed himself, and it didn't taste very good. Because the body heat loss was too serious, Su Buling drank the wine in the jar with the intention of paying the money tomorrow. The bitter wine went into his throat, and his body warmed up a little, and the feeling of hunger in his stomach surged up. Su Buling looked around. He was almost freezing to death from hunger and cold, so he didn't say anything polite. He scooped a few spoonfuls of rice from the millet jar, washed it, and put it on the small stove to cook, and then prepared some dishes. There were no vegetables in the winter, and the most nutritious thing was stewed dog meat, especially black dog. Su Buling looked at the little black dog that had fainted at the door, licked his lips, and finally didn't feel embarrassed to eat the door god. Instead, he took a few salted fish from the window, and took out the pickled sauerkraut from the jar next to the stove, and made sauerkraut fish in a big pot. Su Buling's cooking skills were not good, and he was even disliked by Aunt Lu, but it was definitely not deadly. About half an hour later, a pot of steaming fish soup was cooked. It was probably edible, but the color had a bit of the flavor of the stargazing pie. Su Buling blinked his eyes, muttered to himself, "A real man is not particular about trivial matters," and then took the bowls and chopsticks, filled the fish soup with white rice, and sat on the small wooden stool behind the earthen stove to eat heartily. When people are hungry, everything tastes delicious, not to mention this freezing weather, it feels really good after eating. Although Su Buling is not fat, he has a strong body. To support such a large consumption, his appetite must be amazing. A big pot of rice and a pot of fish soup, not a drop left. The hot soup and the bonfire made me sweat, and the pain in my body also subsided immediately. Su Buling put his robes next to the earthen stove to dry, put his sword next to him, and then he rested on the pile of firewood, closed his eyes, and gradually fell into a state of dozing.